Welcome back to the next installment in the coronavirus 2020 pandemic government lessons. I'm your host, Mr. Lucas. Today, we'll be talking about the minimum wage. So, bear with me. This is my first time using Screencast-O-Matic, so my apologies if my video is blocking some of the screen or something, but I'll do my best to explain things. So, part of government class in Ohio requires you to have about a week of financial literacy. And financial literacy talks about budgeting, talks about wages, maybe even a little bit of credit cards here and there. So this week, that's what we're focusing on. So hopefully by this point, you've watched the Ed Puzzle, 30 Days on Minimum Wage, which actually took place in Columbus, Ohio, which is kind of cool. You might see some familiar spots. And this is where Morgan Spurlock and his fiance, they actually tried to live for 30 days on minimum wage, and hopefully you saw how difficult that was. So let's talk about the minimum wage. What are the different perspectives out there politically on the minimum wage and what should be done about it, okay? So I'm going to break it down for you by political ideology. We'll start here with Democrats and socialists. We'll go through Republicans and libertarians as well, and we'll talk about what they believe about the minimum wage and what they think should be done, okay? So let's go ahead and get started then. Democrats and socialists, will begin with them, sometimes known as liberals and progressives. They advocate for a higher minimum wage, and they think that higher minimum wage helps lift people out of poverty. I mean, think about Mr. Spurlock. If he had more money in his income, he may have been able to afford more. Republicans, conservatives, on the other hand, they state that too high an increase in the minimum wage is going to hurt job creation. It's going to make things more expensive, thus stifling economic growth. If McDonald's has to pay their employees more, they're going to do one of two things. They're either going to cut their hours, hire less people, maybe even cut people from the workforce, or they might increase their prices. Well, if there's a minimum wage increase and everyone has to increase their prices, well, that didn't really do that much for the minimum wage. It just causes inflation, which means you just got to raise the minimum wage even more. Libertarians, on the other hand, are a bit more extreme. They agree with conservatives that a minimum wage hurts the economy, but they also believe the minimum wage is immoral. If I want to work for $7 an hour and Amazon wants to hire me for $7 an hour, why should government get involved and stop us from engaging in that transaction? I mean, why is it anyone else's business if I want to be paid for $5 an hour for a job and someone wants to hire me for that? That's between me and them. So libertarians believe it's immoral to outlaw jobs in any way and for government to step in and say, no, you can't work for that person, or hey, you can't hire that person if both parties agree on it. So don't just take it from me if you're thinking, oh, that's nice, Mr. Lucas, but what do they really say? Well, you might not be able to see the Bernie Sanders quote up here, but Bernie Sanders, you may know, he has supported increasing the minimum wage. He says the current federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour is a starvation wage. It must be raised. The minimum wage must become a living wage, which means raising it to $15 an hour over the next few years. Donald Trump, a Republican, has a very Republican position on the minimum wage. He says, I would like to leave the minimum wage to the states because every state is different. $7.25 per hour is pretty tough to live on. States have to compete with each other in outside interests. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means for states to compete with each other a little bit later. And then this dude over here, Murray Rothbard, he's a libertarian. So he's got a very libertarian perspective. He says, in truth, there's only one way to regard the minimum wage law. It is compulsory unemployment, period. The law says it is illegal and therefore criminal for anyone to hire anyone else below the level of X dollars an hour. This means, plainly and simply, that a large number of free and voluntary wage contracts are now outlawed, and hence that there will be a large amount of unemployment. Remember that the minimum wage law provides no jobs, it only outlaws them, and outlawed jobs are the inevitable result. So let's start here with Democrats, liberals, progressives, socialists again, and kind of talk about maybe some evidence that backs up their point of view, their perspective. For one, you have to understand where socialists and Democrats, where they're coming from in terms of their perspective on labor. A lot of times they will view low minimum wages as exploitative. So for example, this meme kind of encapsulates that. McDonald's CEO says paying workers a living wage will force them to raise prices, kind of like I had mentioned Republicans argue. after tripling his salary to $14 million and not raising prices a penny. So this is kind of the idea that workers that work for a very low wage, if their CEOs are making millions and millions of dollars, they can afford to raise the wages of their workers. After all, if it wasn't for their workers, they wouldn't have a business that would be successful. They have to have people making things and selling things in order for them to be successful in business. So tripling their salary to millions or billions of dollars at the expense of paying their employees the bare minimum is exploitation. And the minimum wage helps to alleviate that and at least provide some relief. Plus, many liberals will argue most developed nations have a minimum wage. You can see on this map here, most recent data shows you the darker the blue, the higher the minimum wage. The lighter the blue, the kind of gray, white, there's like little to no minimum wage at all in those countries. So you can see most developed nations, most wealthy nations in Europe, Australia, the United States, they have a minimum wage. Now, they will also say that if the wages increase to just the right amount, it's not going to be enough to impact job growth, which again, that's kind of countering the Republican claim. So if you change the minimum wage to just the right amount, where it's not too much, it won't force businesses to lay people off or raise their prices. And so there's some evidence that backs that up. And you can see this here, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. States that did not raise the minimum wage in January 2014 only had a 0.7% change in employment, whereas states that did raise their minimum wage in January 2014 saw a 0.9% change in employment. So really the difference between states that raised their minimum wage and states that didn't in terms of employment, people getting laid off, was very, very small, very negligible. And again, the federal minimum wage has not increased since 2009. And this quote kind of shows you the fact that they want it to be a living wage, something that you can live off of, something you can afford, rent, and basic necessities. It says here, minimum wage workers are not earning enough to keep up with the increased standard in living, which is what the law was originally intended to do. The federal minimum wage has not increased since 2009. Well, let's take a look at Licking County, and let's see what the standard living is in Licking County. What is the bare minimum salary you need to be able to afford an apartment or to be able to go out and get groceries? Nationally, there are some studies that suggest that a living minimum wage should be about $21.72 an hour. Let's see what it would be in Licking County. Oh, gotta go back here. In Licking County, this shows us that for one adult that's working with no kids, the bare minimum living wage is $11.46. So if you have one child, that goes up to $24.27. And this breaks down the typical expenses in Licking County for 0 children to 3 children and so forth. Breaks it down by food, childcare, medical, housing, transportation, and all of that. Shows you about how expensive it is to be able to afford things and live at least a decent life. And so this is why a lot of people will argue $7.25 isn't enough. It's got to go up to maybe at least $10, at least maybe $12 an hour. And again, that's going to depend on where you live, because the standard of living in some places is a lot higher than others. So some arguments against raising the minimum wage and some arguments for abolishing it. Well, again, it kind of goes back to, if you are forcing an employer to pay their employees like $15 an hour, what's to stop them, especially in this day and age of robots, from just getting a machine to do their job? With a machine, yes, you'll have to pay an initial cost to buy the robot, but you're not going to have to pay for benefits. You're not going to have to pay that machine $15 an hour. So if McDonald's employees want $15 an hour, well, say hello to your replacement. It's a machine where you can just simply put in your order on the screen. You can pay right there with your card. That's one less employee McDonald's has to pay for. And so therefore, McDonald's can pay the employees they do have more, and maybe they can even produce more and lower their prices, which helps them compete against Burger King, against Chick-fil-A, and other places. So let's take a little scenario here. Let's say I wanted to paint my classroom, and my classroom is very boring. It's white, and I kind of want it to change. Well, let's say I've got 20 bucks in my budget to do that. Now keep in mind, I got to buy supplies. I got to buy the paint and the brushes. That'll cost about, let's say, $10. I'm only hiring one person. Now here are my offers for how much I'm willing to hire you for. $1, $5, or $10. I would think most people would say, yeah, I'll take the $10. All right, that's the max you'll pay me. I'll take that then. Cool. Now let's take the same scenario and say I wanted to hire 2 of you, but I only have $20 in my budget. Again, and had to spend $10 on supplies. How much would each of you like paid per hour? Well, here are my offers. $1, $3, or the max I can offer is $5. All right, I would assume the two people I'd hire would say, yeah, we'll take the max you can give us, $5. But wait a second. Stop, Mr. Lucas. You can't hire anyone below $870. That's illegal. I'm the government, and I'm here to tell you that if that's all you have in your budget, you can only hire one person to do that job. The other person you wanted to hire, you cannot hire. So under this, one person is left unemployed with $0, whereas they could have had $5, learned valuable skills, and gotten experience. But hey, the one guy I hired, they got $10, so they're doing pretty well. But what you don't see is the person that didn't get hired and the fact that they have nothing and they don't have any experience to build on a resume. I mentioned Trump earlier, talked about states competing. Well, let's say that you're a business and you want to create new factories, new branches in another state. Which state would you put your business knowing that you're going to have to hire people? You would probably pick the state with the lowest minimum wage. In this case, it would be Alabama. And so you would likely move your factory there instead of going to California or Ohio. All right, so businesses are impacted by minimum wage increases in other states because it impacts their overall cost of business in that state. This means they got to reallocate money to fund the workers in that state. Businesses might leave a state to go to another state with a lower minimum wage. You also have to keep in mind the cost of living. In states with higher minimum wages, things cost more. They're more expensive. Just go to California and see how expensive basic things are there. Much more expensive, but the minimum wage is higher. Sometimes people debate about whether or not the minimum wage causes the inflation in that state to occur, or if the inflation in that state already happens and the minimum wage is just retroactive and keeping up with it. So we'll jump ahead to this. Here's the current minimum wages in all of the states right now as of January 2020. $870 in Ohio, but notice in a lot of the southern states, there's no state minimum wage. So they take the bare minimum, which is the federal minimum wage of $7.25. California, it's $13. Washington, $13.50. New York, $11.80. If we were to take a look at what states people are leaving and moving to, and this is predicting what the census this year is going to show us, people are leaving the states with higher standards of living and higher minimum wages, and they're moving to states with lower minimum wages, particularly in the South. And perhaps that's because businesses are leaving the states like New York and California, and they're going to Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and states in the South where it's cheaper for them to hire people. You can also extrapolate this out to the world and say, if I had a factory and I wanted to produce shoes or something, where would I go set my factory up? In the United States, Mexico, or in a country where there's no minimum wage? And I can just ask my workers, what would you like paid? And then I'll take the lowest offer I get to keep costs down. This is why you see a lot of the products that you wear, whether it's shoes or clothing, made in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh. In those countries, they don't have minimum wages. So they get to pay their employees very, very little. There's also no labor laws there. There's no 8-hour work days or weekends. So they can produce a lot very quickly at a very low cost, which helps them to lower the price for you when you go to buy Nike or clothes in another country. So I've got 2 videos here for you. Watch these on your own time before you do the critical thinking question. But for your assignments, you're going to share your opinion on the minimum wage with a critical thinking question in Google Classroom. So here's the rubric for you, okay? Make sure you take a look at that. I will say, if I get responses that look like this, I think the minimum wage should be lowered to $15 an hour because it's not fair, and that's just like 2 or 3 sentences. Yeah, you're not getting much for that, okay? But if it's good, use the data I've given you in the slides. Also use the videos that I'm giving you. If you use things from that and put it in your response, that's going to help you get a much better grade. So look at the rubric, make sure that you look through this slide, use some of the data and the resources I've given you, and you should do well. That's in Google Classroom. It will be due at the end of the week, so make sure you get that done. I also posted a link here that's got more information on the pros and cons of the minimum wage to help you out as well. Okay? Good luck.